The horse strained against its harness, its breath pluming in the wind that bit with the fury of a cornered wolf. The man driving the wagon, a sour-faced mule skinner named Jed, cursed the animal, the snow, and the woman huddled in the back. He pulled the wagon to a stop where the trail narrowed, a place where the pines stood like silent, white-robed judges. "This is as far as I go," he grunted, not bothering to turn around. "The pass is closing up. Another hour and no team will get through till spring." Clara didn't answer. The cold had seeped so deep into her bones that words felt like shards of glass in her throat. Her ankle, twisted when she'd been thrown into the wagon 2 days prior, throbbed with a dull, insistent fire that did little to warm the rest of her. Frost had crusted on the edges of her thin shawl and turned the tips of her fingers a dead, waxy white. Jed finally turned, his eyes small and hard in his weathered face. "Get out!" She fumbled with the worn blanket, her movements clumsy and slow. Every muscle screamed in protest. She had run for nearly a mile through the woods to escape, and the payment for that freedom was a body bruised and battered, a spirit hanging by a thread. He had found her on the road, half frozen, and for the price of the last silver dollar she owned. He'd agreed to take her toward the next town. He'd taken the coin, but his promise had frozen over with the trail. "Please," she whispered, the sound swallowed by the wind. "The town. You said you were going to Benton." "Plans change," he spat. "Now get out before I throw you out." He made a move toward her, and that was enough. Fear, a more potent fuel than warmth, propelled her into action. She slid over the side of the wagon, her injured ankle giving way the moment it touched the ground. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips as she collapsed into the snow, the impact jarring her to her core. The mule skinner just watched, his expression unchanged. He tossed a small, half-empty sack of hardtack onto the snow beside her. "Don't say I left you with nothing," he said, then cracked the reins. The wagon groaned as it turned, leaving deep ruts in the snow before lumbering back the way it had come. Soon, the sound of the creaking wheels was gone, and there was only the wind. It howled through the pines, a lonely, desolate sound that echoed the emptiness inside her. Clara pushed herself up, her teeth chattering so violently she thought they might break. She was alone in the vast, white wilderness of the Montana mountains. To stay here was to die. With a sob that froze on her lips, she began to walk, dragging her useless foot through the deepening snow. Her only guide, the faint depression in the snow that might have been a trail. Each step was an agony. The world blurred into a swirl of white, the sky and the ground becoming one. She thought of her stepfather, Silas, his face pinched and desperate as he'd made the deal. He had not looked at her, only at the stack of coins the other man had placed on the table. She had been livestock, a bargaining chip to settle a gambling debt. She remembered the man, Brody, his hands thick and calloused, his eyes roaming over her in a way that had made her skin crawl. He had smiled, a cruel twist of his lips, and said, "She'll do." The memory gave her a surge of adrenaline. She would not go back. She would rather the wilderness take her than let that man put his hands on her again. She did not know how long she walked. Time had lost its meaning, measured only in the struggle of one breath to the next. The satchel of hardtack was lost somewhere behind her, dropped by a hand too numb to hold it. Her vision began to tunnel, the edges darkening. Just as the last of her strength gave out, just as her knees began to buckle for the final time, she saw it. Through the blinding curtain of snow, a flicker of something dark against the white, a shape, a cabin, smoke, a thin gray ribbon, curled from a stone chimney, a sign of life in a world that seemed determined to claim hers. Hope, fierce and desperate, gave her the will for a few more steps. She stumbled forward, her mind fixed on that wisp of smoke. It was her entire world. She reached the door, a solid plank of weathered wood, and raised a fist that felt like a block of ice. She knocked once, twice, the sound barely audible over the storm. Then the darkness at the edges of her vision consumed everything, and she collapsed against the door, the cold finally winning its battle. The door opened with a sudden jerk, and she spilled inward, landing in a heap on the rough-hewn floorboards. For a moment, there was only the shocking sensation of warmth against her frozen cheek. Then, a pair of heavy boots stepped into her line of sight. She looked up, her vision swimming. A man stood over her, a mountain of a man cloaked in shadow, the faint light from a fireplace outlining his broad shoulders. He held a rifle in one hand, held loosely but ready. "What trouble are you?" a voice rumbled, low and rough like stones grinding together. Clara tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, the effort immense. "Lost," she managed to croak. "Storm." The man, Eli Morgan, looked down at her, his face a mask of hardened indifference. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were narrowed with suspicion. He saw a woman half dead on his floor, her dress torn, a dark bruise coloring her jaw, and a wild, haunted look in her eyes that spoke of more than just being lost in a blizzard. He had built this cabin far from any town, high in the mountains, precisely to avoid this kind of trouble. People were trouble. He wanted no part of it. But the law of the mountains was unforgiving, and so was its code. You did not leave a dog to freeze in a storm like this, much less a person. With a deep, weary sigh that seemed to drag up years of bitterness, he leaned the rifle against the wall. "Get in by the fire," he said. It was not an invitation. It was a command. He bent down, not gently, and hooked his hands under her arms, hauling her to her feet. She cried out as her weight settled on her injured ankle, and he grunted, half carrying, half dragging her to the stone hearth where a small fire crackled. He deposited her on a rough fur pelt and stepped back, crossing his arms as he watched her. Clara huddled close to the flames, the warmth so intense it was painful on her frozen skin. She trembled uncontrollably. Her body caught between the memory of the cold and the reality of the heat. She was alive. For now. She stayed there for a long time, simply absorbing the heat while the man moved about the one-room cabin with a quiet economy of motion. He added a log to the fire, his movements sure and steady. He checked the seal on the window, then barred the door, shutting out the storm's relentless assault. The cabin was sparse, containing only what was necessary for survival: a bed in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, shelves holding tins of food, and a rack of traps and tools on the wall. It was the home of a man who lived with himself and asked for nothing more. When she could finally feel her fingers again, she tried to sit up straighter, acutely aware of his eyes on her. He had not said another word. He stood by the table, cleaning his rifle, his attention seemingly on his work, but she felt his gaze like a physical weight. "Thank you," she said, her voice still weak. He glanced at her, then back at his rifle. "Don't thank me. I aim to send you on your way as soon as this blows over." "Of course," she said quickly. "I wouldn't impose—" He finished with the rifle and set it back on its pegs. He ladled some stew from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl and handed it to her, along with a spoon. "Eat." The stew was thin, mostly broth and a few pieces of jerky and potato, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She ate slowly, trying not to appear as ravenous as she felt. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. She knew he was waiting for an explanation, and her mind raced, trying to weave a story that would satisfy him without revealing the dangerous truth. The truth would get her killed. Brody would have men looking for her, and no one would help a runaway piece of property. "My name is Clara," she offered, setting the empty bowl down. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Eli?" "I was on my way to Benton," she began, her voice gaining a little strength. She kept her eyes on the fire, unable to meet his penetrating gaze. "I was to be married. My fiancé—" He was supposed to meet me at the stagecoach stop in the last town. He never came. It was a weak story, full of holes, but it was the best she could do. I used my last dollar to hire a man with a wagon to take me on to Benton. I thought perhaps my fiancé had gone on ahead. But the driver, he left me when the storm got bad. Eli said nothing. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw the way she clutched her shawl, the way her eyes darted to the door every time the wind battered against it. He saw that she had not yet taken off her boots, though they were soaked through. She was a frightened animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The story of a jilted bride-to-be did not fit the terror he saw in her. Jilted women were angry or sad. They were not hunted. As she stared into the flames, the warmth and the food making her drowsy, her mind drifted back. The memory came unbidden, sharp and clear. She was standing in the cramped parlor of her stepfather's house. The air was stale with the smell of cheap whiskey and regret. Silas stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Across the table sat Brody, the rancher whose land bordered their failing plot. Brody was a big man, his wealth displayed in the fine leather of his boots and the silver buckle on his belt. He was looking at Clara. "The debt stands at $200. Silas," Brody said, his voice a low drawl that did nothing to hide the steel beneath it. "I've been patient." "I'll have it," Silas mumbled, his voice thick. "The crop, it was a bad year." "It's always a bad year for you," Brody said, his gaze never leaving Clara. He smiled, and it made her stomach clench. "But I'm a reasonable man. I see you have an asset you're not making use of." Clara felt a cold dread wash over her. She knew what he meant. She was 19, and her stepfather had made it clear she was another mouth to feed, another burden. "Clara?" Silas finally turned, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. "Mr. Brody has made a generous offer. He's willing to forgive the debt entirely." "What offer?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Brody answered for him. He leaned forward, placing his thick hands on the table. "I'm in need of a wife, a woman to keep my house in order. You look strong, healthy. You'll do. We'll have the preacher say the words tomorrow, and your stepfather's debt will be cleared." The room spun. It was not a proposal. It was a transaction. She was being sold. She looked at Silas, at the man her mother had married, hoping to see some flicker of protest, some sign that he would protect her. She saw only shame and relief. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I won't," she said, the words barely a whisper. Brody's smile vanished. "It's not a question." A log in the fireplace popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Clara jumped, a small gasp escaping her lips. She snapped back to the present, her heart hammering against her ribs. Eli was still watching her. He had not moved, but he had seen it all, the jump, the panic in her eyes. He knew her fear was not of him, but of something far worse she had left behind her. The storm did not let up. For 2 days, it raged, piling snow against the cabin until it covered the lower half of the single window, casting the room in a perpetual twilight. They were trapped, two strangers bound together by the whims of the weather. The silence became their third companion. It was a living thing, filling the space between them, heavy with suspicion on his side and terror on hers. Their conversations were brief and functional, stripped of all pleasantries. "Is there more water?" "Bucket by the door." "The fire is low." "There's wood." On the second day, Clara could no longer stand the idleness, the feeling of being a useless burden. Her ankle was still swollen and tender, but she could put a little weight on it. She saw Eli preparing to go out to the small lean-to for more firewood and stood up stiffly. "I can help," she said. He paused, his hand on the latch, and gave her a look that was part annoyance, part disbelief. "Stay by the fire. You're no good to me with a frozen lung." "I can't just sit here," she insisted, her voice tight. I can chop vegetables. I can sweep the floor." He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod and went outside, returning a minute later with his arms full of logs, a dusting of snow on his hat and shoulders. He dropped the wood into the box by the hearth with a crash that made her flinch again. He said nothing as she found the small broom and began to sweep, her movements slow and pained. He saw her hands shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper, nerves or exhaustion or both. He said nothing. His care, when it came, was as silent and gruff as he was. He began leaving a smaller stack of wood directly beside her chair, wood that was easier for her to handle. He left a bowl of water and a cloth on the floor near where she slept, a silent acknowledgement of her need to clean the grime of her journey from her face and hands. One afternoon, she took off one of her gloves to warm her fingers and set it on the hearth, not noticing the small tear in the palm. Later, when she went to put it back on, she found it had been mended. The stitches were thick and clumsy, the work of a man unused to a needle and thread, but they were strong. They would hold. Her throat tightened with an unfamiliar emotion. It was a kindness so small and quiet she might have missed it, and it touched her more than any words could have. That night, the third night, the storm howled with a renewed vengeance, rattling the very bones of the cabin. Sleep was a long time coming for Clara. When it finally did, it offered no peace. It dragged her back to Brody's ranch, to the small, dark room he had locked her in after she had tried to refuse him. The smell of whiskey was on his breath, his shadow falling over her, his voice slurring as he told her what a husband expected, what she now owed him. She woke with a scream caught in her throat, a raw, terrified sound that filled the small cabin. She was thrashing, tangled in the thin blanket, her hands held up as if to ward off a blow. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to glowing orange embers. In an instant, Eli was on his feet, his form a dark shape against the dying light. He did not rush toward her or speak. He stood for a moment, letting the echoes of her scream fade, watching as she slowly came to her senses, her gasps for air loud in the sudden quiet. Her body was trembling, slick with a cold sweat. He moved then, not to her side, but to the foot of his own cot. He picked up the heavy wool blanket that lay there, the one he used on the coldest nights. He walked over to where she sat huddled on the floor, a miserable, shaking bundle. Without a word, he unfolded the blanket and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was immense, a solid, comforting pressure. His fingers brushed her neck for a fraction of a second, his touch calloused and impersonal. Yet it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. She looked up at him, her eyes wide in the dim light, but his face was in shadow. He turned away and dragged one of the heavy wooden chairs over to the door, setting it down with a quiet thud. He sat, his back to her, and picked up his rifle, laying it across his lap. He did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat watch, a silent guardian between her and the terrors of the night, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. Clara pulled the heavy blanket tighter around her, the scent of pine smoke and cold leather clinging to the wool. She watched his still, broad back, the way he faced the door as if expecting her demons to break it down. And slowly, for the first time in days, the frantic pounding of her heart began to subside. The storm raged on outside, but inside the small, quiet cabin, a different kind of storm had begun to calm. She lay back down, her eyes still on the man at the door, and eventually, under his silent protection, she drifted into a dreamless sleep. The morning after her nightmare, a fragile quiet settled over the cabin. The storm still raged, a constant, mournful cry against the logs. But inside, the air had changed. When Clara awoke, Eli was already up, sitting at the table, a steaming mug of coffee held in his big hands. He did not look at her when she stirred, but she felt his awareness of her all the same. The heavy wool blanket was still draped over her, a tangible reminder of his silent intervention. Her scream, the raw terror of it, hung in the space between them, an embarrassment that made her cheeks burn. She folded the blanket carefully and placed it at the foot of his cot, a wordless thank you. He gave a short, stiff nod in acknowledgement, his eyes fixed on the swirling liquid in his mug. He had not sat guard by the door all night, but when she had woken once in the deep darkness, she had seen his silhouette still in the chair, a long shadow of protection. He had moved back to his bed only when the first gray light of dawn had begun to filter through the snow-caked window. Breakfast was a silent affair. He passed her a plate of fried salt pork and a piece of hard biscuit. The tension that had defined their first days together had shifted. It was no longer the sharp edge of suspicion, but the dull weight of things unspoken. Clara knew the lie she had told was a flimsy thing, a ragged cloak that could not possibly cover the truth of her fear. His kindness, as rough and unadorned as it was, demanded more from her. It deserved, at the very least, the dismantling of a falsehood. She waited until he had finished eating, until he was staring into the fire, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. She took a breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "Eli," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned his head slowly, his gaze heavy. "What I told you before, about my fiancé," she began, her eyes dropping to the floorboards. "It was not the truth." He did not seem surprised. He simply waited, his patience a palpable thing in the quiet room. "I am not a bride, not in the way you think," she continued, the words coming in a rush. "There was no man waiting for me in Benton. There was no choice." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to go on. "My stepfather, he owed a debt. The man he owed it to, he agreed to take me instead of payment. It was a transaction. He was to take me as his wife, and my stepfather's slate would be wiped clean." She risked a glance at him. His face was like granite, his expression giving nothing away, but he was listening. Every line of his body was still attentive. "He was not a good man," she said, the understatement a raw wound in her throat. When he tried to force the arrangement, I just ran. I took nothing. I had no plan. I just knew I could not stay. I would have let the mountains take me before I let him." Her voice broke, and she could not finish the sentence. The shame of it all, of being sold, of being treated as less than human, washed over her. Eli was silent for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the unending howl of the wind. Clara braced herself for his judgment, for the cold dismissal she expected. He had no reason to take on her troubles. He had every right to cast her back out into the storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. "This man, he has a name?" "Brody," she whispered. "Abel Brody. He has a large ranch a few days east of here." Eli nodded slowly, filing the name away. He stood up and walked to the door, peering out a small peephole he had drilled in the wood. "Snow's not stopping. Could be another week." He turned back to her, his gaze direct and clear. "You are safe here until the pass opens. No one will come looking for you in this." And that was all. No more questions, no judgment, just a simple statement of fact. You are safe here. For Clara, who had not felt safe in years, the words were a stronger balm than any medicine. The weight in her chest eased, just a little. As the days bled into one another, a strange and unspoken partnership began to form. Clara, desperate to repay his protection, took over the care of the cabin. It became her domain. She found his meager supplies and, with a resourcefulness born of a hard life, made them into satisfying meals. The scent of baking bread soon filled the small space, a warm, comforting aroma that seemed to fight back against the cold gloom. She scrubbed the floors, mended his torn shirts with threads she unraveled from the hem of her petticoat, and kept the fire fed. She brought a sense of order to his solitary existence, a gentle touch that softened the cabin's hard edges. Eli seemed, at first, annoyed by the intrusion. He was a man set in his ways, and his routine was being disrupted. He would watch her, a frown creasing his brow. As she moved about the space he had claimed as his sanctuary from the world, but he never told her to stop. He ate the food she cooked without comment, though she noticed he always finished every last crumb. He wore the shirts she mended without a word of thanks. His acceptance was in his silence, in the way he allowed her to carve out a place for herself within his walls. He still disappeared for hours at a time, checking his trap lines for the game that kept them fed. It was during these absences that Clara saw small, fleeting glimpses into the man he was. One afternoon, while sweeping near his cot, she saw a small wooden box tucked beneath it. It was not locked, but it felt intensely private. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a piece of worn velvet, was a simple gold wedding band, thin and delicate. It was a woman's ring. She closed the box quickly, her heart aching with a sudden, sharp pang of understanding. He was not a man who had chosen solitude. It had been forced upon him. Another day, as the snow outside briefly subsided into a flurry of light flakes. She looked through the window. She saw him at the far edge of the clearing, near a tall, stoic pine tree. He was standing perfectly still, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. At the base of the tree was a mound of stones, now covered in a thick blanket of white. A grave. He stood there for a long time, a lone figure paying his respects to a ghost, before he finally put on his hat and trudged back to the cabin, his face grim and shuttered. He never mentioned it, and she never asked. Their silent truce was shattered on the 5th day. The wood box was nearly empty, and Eli was late returning from his traps. Clara, filled with a restless energy, decided she could not wait. She had watched him split logs a dozen times. It looked simple enough. She put on his oversized coat, pulled on her mended gloves, and grabbed the heavy axe from its place by the door. The cold hit her instantly, but the work, she thought, would warm her. She was wrong. The axe was heavier than she had imagined, awkward and unwieldy in her grasp. She set a round of wood on the chopping block and swung. The axe head glanced off the side with a dull thud, jarring her arms. She tried again and again, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt. She was not weak, but her body was still recovering, and her hands, unused to such rough labor, began to ache. Determined not to be useless, she put all of her remaining strength into one final swing. The axe bit into the wood, but at an angle. The force of the blow ripped the handle through her grip. A searing pain shot through her palms. She dropped the axe and cried out, looking down at her hands. Both of her palms were raw and bleeding, the rough wood having torn the skin clean away. Tears of pain and frustration welled in her eyes. It was then that Eli emerged from the trees, a string of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He stopped dead when he saw her, his eyes taking in the scene, the axe on the ground, the mangled log, her hunched form. His face darkened with a swift and sudden anger. "What in God's name are you doing?" he growled, his voice a low thunder. He strode over and snatched the axe from the snow. "Are you trying to lose a foot? Or maybe just a few fingers? Do you have any idea how stupid that was?" His words were like slaps. All the fear, the shame, and the desperate need to prove her worth that she had been holding inside finally broke free. "Stupid?" she cried, her voice choked with tears. She held up her bleeding hands. "I was trying to help. I am not a child, and I will not be a burden to you. I know you wish I was not here. I know you hate having me in your cabin, disrupting your peace. You do not have to pretend. Just say you want me gone." Her outburst stunned him into silence. He stared at her, at the tears tracking paths through the grime on her cheeks, at the blood welling in her palms. His anger evaporated as quickly as it had come, replaced by a look of profound regret. He saw not a foolish woman, but a proud one. Pushed to her breaking point, He saw the desperation behind her reckless act. He let out a long breath, the cold air turning it to smoke. He looked down at the axe in his hand, then back at her. For the first time, he seemed at a loss. I am sorry," he said, the words sounding foreign and rough on his tongue. He would not meet her eyes. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "I did not mean. I was only worried you would hurt yourself badly." He reached out, his movement hesitant, and gently took her arm. "Come inside. Let me see to your hands." His touch was surprisingly careful. He led her back into the warmth of the cabin and sat her down in a chair by the fire. He fetched the water basin and a clean cloth, and with a tenderness that seemed completely at odds with his gruff exterior, he began to clean her wounds. His large, calloused fingers were deft as he washed away the blood and grime, then applied a foul-smelling but effective salve from a small tin. He wrapped her hands in strips of clean linen, his movements slow and methodical. He did not speak again until he was done. He knelt before her, tying off the last bandage. "You are not a burden, Clara," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the fire. He still would not look at her. That night, they ate dinner in a new kind of silence. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding. A wall between them had crumbled. Later, long after Clara had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Eli sat by the fire, the cabin silent around him. The act of tending to her injuries had stirred something deep within him, a memory he usually kept buried under a mountain of grief and rage. He closed his eyes, and the past came for him. He was 24, and the world was full of promise. The cabin was smaller then, and it rang with the laughter of his wife. Sarah. She had hair the color of corn silk and a smile that could chase away the darkest mood. They had built this place with their own hands on land his father had settled, a beautiful piece of earth with a creek that ran clear and cold. They were going to have a child. Sarah was already showing, her belly a gentle swell that held all of his hopes. Then the railroad came. Men in fine suits arrived from the east, carrying papers that they claimed gave them rights to a wide swath of land, a swath that cut directly through his property. They offered him a pittance for it. He had refused. He had the deed, signed and sealed. He believed in the law. The railroad men had hired thugs, men with hard eyes and guns on their hips, to persuade the local settlers. There were threats, then small acts of violence, a fence cut, a well poisoned. Eli had ridden to Benton to see the sheriff, a man named Cutler. He had shown him the deed and told him about the threats. Sheriff Cutler had looked at him with bored, indifferent eyes. "This is a dispute over property. Morgan," he had said, "a civil matter. The law cannot get involved unless a real crime is committed." A week later, a real crime was committed. He had been out hunting. He saw the smoke from miles away, a thick black pillar against the blue sky. He ran, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The cabin was an inferno. The thugs had not waited for him to be home. He found Sarah near the creek, where she must have been fetching water. They had not even given her a chance to run. He had carried her body all the way to Benton, a 30-mile journey fueled by a grief so vast it left no room for anything else. He had laid her on the steps of the sheriff's office. Cutler had come out, his face pale. "It was the railroad men," Eli had choked out. The sheriff had looked away. "You have no proof, son. Could have been a stray spark from the hearth, a terrible accident." In that moment, Eli's faith did not just break, it shattered. He saw the truth in the sheriff's shifty gaze. Justice was not blind. It was for sale. It belonged to the men with the deepest pockets. He had buried Sarah himself, under the big pine tree at the edge of their land. Then he had turned his back on the world. He had rebuilt the cabin, bigger and stronger. Not as a home, but as a fortress. He had trusted no one, needed no one. He had survived, but he had not lived. Eli opened his eyes, the fire in the hearth having burned down to embers. The ghosts of his past slowly receded, leaving behind the familiar ache of loss. He looked over at Clara, sleeping peacefully, her bandaged hands resting on top of the blanket. She was trouble, just as he had first thought, but she was not the kind of trouble he had expected. A few nights later, Clara was woken by a faint, rhythmic sound. It was the soft scrape of a knife against wood. She sat up, her curiosity piqued. The fire cast a low, flickering light across the room. She could see Eli at the table, his back to her. He was bent over something in his hands, his focus absolute. She slipped quietly from her bedding and crept closer, staying in the shadows where he would not see her. He was holding a small block of pine, and with a small, sharp knife, he was carving. Shavings fell like soft snow onto the table. As she watched, the shape became clear. It was a horse, no bigger than her palm. It was exquisite, the lines perfect, the head arched with a wild and free spirit, its tiny legs carved as if in mid-gallop. There was a love in his work that was breathtaking. This was not the idle whittling of a lonely man. This was a creation born from a deep and profound emotion. She thought of the woman's ring in the box, of the silent grave beneath the pine tree. She suddenly knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this tiny horse was a gift that had never been given, a memory of a future that had been stolen from him. A wave of compassion washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. This silent, angry man was not hard. He was shattered, and in his broken pieces, she saw a reflection of her own. Without making a sound, she retreated to her bed, her heart full of a sorrow that was not entirely her own. The storm outside seemed a little less menacing. She was no longer just afraid of the man in the cabin. She was beginning to understand him. After what felt like an eternity, the storm began to lose its voice. The relentless, deafening howl that had been the soundtrack to their lives softened into a low, weary moan. The snow, which had fallen in a thick, blinding curtain for more than a week, thinned to a gentle flurry. For the first time, Clara could see the tops of the pine trees, their branches heavy and bowed under the immense weight of the snow. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a soft, gray light into the cabin. The world outside was still a fortress of white, but it was no longer at war with them. With the easing of the storm came a new and pressing anxiety for Clara. The past would not be clear for weeks, perhaps months, but the thought of leaving, of being sent on her way, was a constant, terrifying presence in her mind. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The fragile safety she had found within these four walls was the only thing she had. The thought of facing the world alone again, of knowing Brody and his men could be searching for her, was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She knew she had to ask. She had to swallow her pride and beg for a charity she felt she did not deserve. She waited for the right moment, a time when the quiet between them felt less like a chasm and more like a shared space. She chose a morning when Eli was mending a snowshoe, his large hands surprisingly deft as he wove new leather straps through the frame. The fire crackled warmly, and the scent of coffee hung in the air. "Eli," she began, her voice small. He grunted in response, his attention still on his work. She took a steadying breath. "When the pass is clear, she faltered, the words catching in her throat. "I have nowhere to go. I have no money, no family to help me. I'm afraid if I go down to Benton or any other town, that man, that Brody, he will find me." He stopped his work, his hands going still. He did not look at her, but she knew he was listening intently. "I was hoping," she said, forcing the words out, "that you might allow me to stay, just until the spring. I can work. I will earn my keep. I can cook and clean, mend your clothes, help with the tanning of the hides. I will not be a burden. Please." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Clara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had laid herself bare. exposed all her desperation. His refusal would be a sentence she did not know how to endure. He set the snowshoe down with deliberate slowness. He stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the endless expanse of white. His back was to her, a formidable wall of buckskin and muscle. "Pass won't be truly clear before May," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Too much snow packed in the high places? Dangerous." He paused, still looking out. "Takes a lot of food to get a person through a winter here. Game gets scarce come February." Her hopes sank. He was telling her it was not possible. He was letting her down with facts, not feelings. Then he turned, and for the first time, he met her gaze directly. There was no anger in his eyes, no annoyance. There was something else, something she could not quite name. A weariness, perhaps, but something deeper, too. A flicker of an emotion he kept locked away. "But the trapping is good this year," he said gruffly. "And I suppose the cabin is big enough. You can stay until spring." Relief washed over Clara so powerfully her knees felt weak. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Do not thank me," he said, turning back to his work as if the matter was settled and of no great importance. "Just keep the fire fed." But she saw it, just for a second before he looked away. A slight softening around his eyes, a relaxing of the hard line of his jaw. He had said yes, but his expression had told her something more. It had told her he did not want her to go. With the question of her future settled, at least for a few months, the cabin took on a new atmosphere. Their routine, once a tense navigation of a shared space, became oddly domestic. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the demands of survival and the quiet habits of two people learning to live together. The days were filled with a comfortable, working silence. He would spend the daylight hours outside, hunting or checking his traps, while she tended to the cabin. She learned the particular way the stove door had to be latched to draw properly, the spot on the floor that creaked, the way the late afternoon sun would hit the small carving of the horse he had placed on the mantelpiece, making the wood seem to glow. When he returned at dusk, his face ruddy from the cold, she would have a hot meal waiting. They ate at the small table, the silence between them no longer heavy with suspicion, but filled with a quiet companionship. On the evenings when he had hides to prepare, she would sit by the fire and read from the one book he owned, a worn copy of the Bible, its pages thin and soft from use, her voice a low murmur in the quiet cabin. There were even moments of levity, as rare and precious as a winter rose. One afternoon, while she was helping him stack firewood inside, a log slipped from her grasp and rolled across the floor, nudging his boot like a playful dog. He looked down at the log, then up at her, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. She smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. And for a moment, the weight of their pasts seemed to lift, leaving them as just a man and a woman sharing a small warmth against the cold. One evening, the fragile peace between them deepened into something more. A sudden squall had blown in, a final, angry gasp of the dying storm. Clara had been outside, just a few yards from the cabin, gathering pine cones for kindling from beneath a snow-laden tree. The wind had shaken the branches, and a heavy load of wet, packed snow had fallen directly on top of her, soaking her from head to foot in an instant. She stumbled back inside, gasping, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. Her thin wool dress was plastered to her skin, and her hands were turning a frightening shade of blue. Eli was on his feet in an instant. He took one look at her and crossed the room, his expression grim. "Get that dress off," he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. She fumbled with the buttons on her bodice, but her fingers were too numb and clumsy. A wave of shivering racked her body, so violent she could not stand still. Without a word, Eli shrugged off the heavy sheepskin coat he always wore. The warmth of his body radiated from it. He wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling the thick collar up around her neck. The coat enveloped her, heavy and smelling of wood smoke, leather, and him. It was an overwhelmingly masculine scent, and it was the safest thing she had ever known. She sagged against him, her shivering beginning to subside under the coat's profound warmth. He did not move away. His hands rested on her shoulders, large and steady, holding the coat in place. She could feel the heat of his palms through the thick wool. For a long moment, they stood there, frozen in a tableau of silent comfort. He reached up with one hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, and brushed a stray strand of wet hair from her forehead. His calloused fingers grazed her temple, and a different kind of shiver went through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a tremor of awareness, of a closeness that was both terrifying and deeply yearned for. She looked up into his eyes and saw a raw emotion there, a deep and aching loneliness that mirrored her own. Neither of them spoke. The moment was too fragile for words. Then, as if realizing he had crossed a line, he dropped his hands and stepped back, his face becoming a familiar, unreadable mask once more. "There's a dry blanket by the fire," he said, his voice gruff. "Stay there until you are warm." That night, the memory of his touch, the feeling of being wrapped in his coat, lingered. She lay in her bedroll, but sleep would not come. The cabin was dark and quiet, save for the sound of his steady breathing from the far corner. The space between them felt vast and empty. She thought of her nightmares, of the terror that always lurked at the edges of her sleep. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that the only time she had felt truly safe was when he had sat watch by the door, his presence a shield against the darkness. "Eli?" she whispered into the blackness. The sound of his breathing stopped. "What is it?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "I am sorry to wake you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It is just, I cannot sleep. I do not feel safe unless I know you are nearby." It was a bold and desperate confession, and the moment the words left her mouth, she wished she could take them back. The silence stretched on, and she was sure he would rebuke her, tell her she was being foolish. "The floor is cold," he said finally. It was not a refusal. A moment later, she heard the rustle of his blankets. He moved through the darkness, his steps sure and quiet. He gathered a few of the spare fur pelts and laid them on the floor near the hearth, not far from her own bed. She heard him lie down, the sound of him settling in, a deep sigh escaping his lips. He was only a few feet away now. She could feel the warmth of his body, hear every breath he took. The vast, empty space was gone. And as she lay there, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing, the fear that had been her constant companion for so long finally loosened its grip. The shared warmth of their presence began to thaw fears that had been frozen in her heart for years. In the darkness of the nights that followed, they began to talk. The anonymity of the dark made it easier to speak of things that the daylight kept hidden. They did not speak of their own histories. Not yet. Instead, they spoke of loss in the abstract, of survival, of what it was that made a life worth fighting for. "Sometimes I think we are no different from the animals," he said one night, his voice a low rumble from the floor. "Just trying to live until the next sunrise. But we remember the sunrises that have passed," she answered softly. "And we can hope for the ones to come. An animal does not hope. It only is, I think hope is what makes the fight worthwhile." Another night, he spoke of the mountains. "They do not care if you live or die. They are stone and ice, but they are honest. They do not lie to you like men do." It was in the safety of one of these quiet, dark conversations that Clara finally found the courage to tell him the rest of her story. She told him about Brody's final act of cruelty, the one that had finally given her the strength of true desperation. "He had been drinking," she said, her voice a near whisper, devoid of all emotion. "I had refused him again, and he became angry. He said a man has a right to mark his own property." She paused, the memory making it hard to breathe. He had a small iron in the fire, a line iron he used for marking his calves. He said he would put his mark on me, so that everyone would always know who I belonged to. The air in the cabin grew cold, the silence absolute. She could feel Eli's stillness from his place on the floor. "I fought him," she continued, her voice gaining a thin, sharp edge. "I hit him with a skillet. It was the only thing I could do. He fell, and I ran. I just ran out the door and into the woods. I did not look back." She hesitated. "He grazed me with it, on my shoulder. The scar is still there." Eli did not move. He did not speak. His silence was more terrifying than any shout. She could feel his fury radiating from him, a palpable, dangerous energy that filled the small space. He was a predator gone still, a mountain lion before the pounce. She lay there, her heart pounding, suddenly afraid of the violence she had unleashed in him. After a long time, he spoke, his voice a strained, gravelly whisper. "Go to sleep, Clara." She said nothing more. Eventually, she heard him rise from the floor. He did not go back to his bed. He walked to the hearth and added a log to the fire, the flames flaring up, casting his long, taut shadow against the wall. Then she heard it, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine, the rhythmic, grating scrape of steel on stone. He was at his workbench, his back to her, and in the flickering firelight, she could see him drawing the long, wicked blade of his hunting knife over his whetstone, back and forth, the sound a quiet, deadly promise in the night. He was not just sharpening a tool, he was preparing for war. 2 weeks later, the outside world finally found them. They heard the crunch of snowshoes and the jingle of a harness long before they saw the man. Eli was instantly alert, grabbing his rifle from its pegs. He stood by the door, listening, his body tense. "Ho, the cabin!" a voice called out. "It is just Jedediah, Eli, bringing you news and a bit of salt." Eli relaxed slightly, unbarring the door. A wiry old trapper with a beard like a snowdrift stood there, a wide grin on his weathered face. He was leading a mule laden with supplies. "Figured you would be running low," Jedediah said, stamping the snow from his boots. "It has been a brutal winter." He brought in a sack of supplies, his eyes widening slightly when he saw Clara sitting by the fire. He tipped his hat to her, his gaze curious but polite. He and Eli spoke for a while, trading news of the winter, of who had survived and who had not. As he was preparing to leave, the old trapper paused. "There is one more thing," he said, his expression turning serious. "There is talk down in Benton. A big rancher named Brody is looking for his runaway bride, offering a bounty, $100 in gold coin. He has riders out, asking questions all through the territory. You would do well to be careful who you open your door to. $100 is enough to make an honest man forget his principles." Jedediah left, and the silence he left behind was heavy and cold. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered. The threat was no longer a ghost from Clara's past. It had a name, a price, and it was coming for them. Eli barred the door, and when he turned to look at her, his face was carved from stone, his eyes the color of a winter storm. The moment the old trapper disappeared back into the endless white, the air in the cabin grew thin and cold. Jedediah's words lingered like a frost, coating every surface with a new layer of fear. $100. A man's life was not worth that much in this part of the country. A runaway woman's was worth even less. Clara sat by the fire, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, and watched Eli. He had not spoken. He had simply barred the door and now stood staring at it, his back a rigid wall of defiance. She could almost hear the thoughts turning in his mind, the cold, hard calculus of survival. He was a man who measured risks, who understood the brutal arithmetic of the wilderness. She was a risk he had not accounted for, a debt that had just come due. She waited for him to speak, her stomach a tight, aching knot. He finally turned from the door, his face set like a winter landscape, hard and unforgiving. Tomorrow at first light, I'm taking you to Miller's Fork. Clara's heart sank. Miller's Fork was a small mining town 2 days' ride to the west, deeper into the mountains. It is a rough place, he continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. But Brody's reach will not extend that far. No one there will know who you are. I will give you what money I have. It will be enough to get you a room for a month. Find some work. From there, you will be on your own. It was a plan, a sensible, logical plan. It was also a dismissal. He was cutting her loose, sending her back out into the world he had so thoroughly abandoned. All the fragile threads of connection they had woven in the dark. Quiet nights were being severed by the cold light of day. No, she said, the word quiet but firm. He frowned, a dark look clouding his features. It is not a request. It is the only way. Brody has men out. $100 is a fortune to most folks. They will turn this mountain upside down looking for you. You are not safe here any longer. And I would be safe in a mining town full of strangers? She countered, a spark of defiance flaring within her. She stood up, facing him, her small frame seeming to gain strength from her resolve. A lone woman with a few dollars in her pocket? How long do you think that would last? I would just be trading one danger for another. It is a better chance than you have here, he insisted, his voice rising. I cannot fight a whole town, and I will not have a bounty hunter knocking on my door. I am not asking you to fight anyone, she said, her voice trembling but gaining in volume. I am asking you not to throw me away. I am tired of running. Eli, I have been running my whole life, from my stepfather's temper, from poverty, from the looks men give me. I ran from Brody. I will not run any more. This is the first place I have ever felt. Still, I will not leave. That is foolish talk, he shot back, taking a step toward her. His size was intimidating, his anger a palpable force in the small room. This is not about what you want. This is about staying alive. Your pride is going to get you killed. My pride is all I have left, she cried, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. You want to send me away to keep yourself safe, to keep your life quiet and empty, just the way you like it. You are right to do it. I have brought nothing but trouble to your door, but do not pretend it is for my sake alone. His jaw clenched, a muscle working furiously in his cheek. You know nothing about me. I know more than you think, she retorted, her voice dropping, sharp and piercing as an icicle. The argument had shifted. It was no longer about Brody, or the bounty. It was about him. It was about them. I know you are hiding, just like me. I am hiding from a man with a gun. But you are hiding from everything else. You are hiding from a ghost. You are hiding from the world. You are hiding from life itself. And right now, she took a shaky breath, her gaze unwavering. You are trying to hide from me. Her words hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second with a look of raw, unguarded pain. He had built his walls so high and so thick, he had thought them impenetrable. And this woman, this half-frozen stray he had taken in, had just walked right through them. The truth of her accusation was a bitter poison, burning through his veins. He said nothing. He could say nothing. He simply turned, his movements stiff and angry, and yanked the cabin door open. He strode out into the cold, slamming the door behind him with a crack that echoed the shattering of the peace between them. Clara sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her, leaving her weak and trembling. She had gone too far. She had taken his private grief, the sorrow she had only glimpsed, and thrown it in his face like a weapon. A wave of regret washed over her, but beneath it was a harder, more stubborn truth. She had not been wrong. Eli went to the one place he always went when the world became too much, the small, cold barn where he kept his tools and stored his furs. The air was frigid, smelling of hay and leather. He paced the length of the small structure like a caged animal, his fists clenched at his sides. He was furious. Furious at her for seeing him, for knowing him in a way no one had in years. Furious at himself for letting her get close enough to see. She was right. He was a coward. He had not run from the fight with the railroad men. He had fought until he had nothing left to fight for. But afterward, he had run from life. He had treated his grief like a fortress, sealing himself inside with the ghosts of his wife and his unborn child. He had let bitterness become his only companion, and Clara, with her quiet strength and her haunted eyes, had breached his defenses. Her presence had brought a warmth to his cabin that had nothing to do with the fire. It had brought life back into the dead spaces of his heart, and it terrified him. Sending her away was the only way he knew to make it stop, to go back to the safe, cold numbness he had lived in for so long. He stayed in the barn for hours, the anger slowly burning itself out, leaving behind a cold, heavy ash of self-loathing. The sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and orange. The cold deepened. He knew he could not stay out here all night. He had to go back. He had to face her. With a deep, weary sigh, he turned and walked back toward the cabin. He expected the door to be unlocked. He expected her to be sitting by the fire, either weeping or staring at him with accusing eyes. He put his hand on the latch. It did not move. He pushed. The door was barred from the inside. She had locked him out. A fresh surge of anger went through him. This was his cabin, his home. He banged his fist on the heavy wood. "Clara, open this door." There was no answer. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. The wind picked up, whipping snow into his face. Still, there was only silence from within. He stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, a new and unfamiliar feeling rising in him. It was not anger. It was fear. Fear that she had taken his words to heart and decided to leave, to run out into the dangerous twilight. Fear that he had finally pushed her away for good. He slumped against the door, defeated. He had driven her away. He had proven her right. He was a coward, hiding from the one thing that had made him feel human again. Just as he was about to turn away, to go back to the cold misery of the barn, he heard a faint sound, the soft scrape of the heavy wooden bar being lifted from its brackets. The door opened slowly, just a few inches. Clara stood in the opening, her form silhouetted against the warm, flickering light of the fire. Her face was pale, her eyes large and dark. "I am not afraid anymore, Eli," she whispered, her voice so soft the wind almost stole it away. "Not of Brody, not of being alone, and not of you." She opened the door wider, a silent invitation. He stepped inside, out of the biting wind, bringing a swirl of snow in with him. He shut the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. They stood there, just a few feet apart, the air thick with unspoken words. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another. She stopped directly in front of him, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her. She looked up at him, her gaze direct and searching. She slowly raised her hand, and he flinched, expecting her to touch his face, to offer a comfort he did not deserve. Instead, she gently took his hand. His was large, calloused, and cold from the outdoors. Hers was small and warm. She did not just hold it, she enclosed it, her fingers curling around his. Then, with a tenderness that undid him completely, she lifted his hand and placed it flat against her chest, directly over her heart. He froze. He could feel it, the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart against his palm. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of life, strong and persistent. It was a sound he had not felt, had not allowed himself to feel, since he had held his wife's hand to her own chest, feeling the frantic, frightened flutter of her heart in the moments before she had told him they were to have a child. His own heart felt as if it had been encased in ice for 5 years. Now, feeling the life in her, the ice began to crack. A tremor went through his hand. He wanted to pull away, to retreat back to the safety of his numbness, but he could not. Her eyes held him, and the steady beat of her heart held him. He could feel the warmth of her spreading up his arm, moving through his chest, thawing him from the inside out. A single, hot tear escaped his eye and tracked a path through the grime on his cheek. It was the first tear he had shed since the day he had buried his wife. The moment stretched on, timeless and profound. It was not a moment of passion or of desire. It was something deeper, something more fundamental. It was the breaking of two long-frozen hearts, a silent and sacred communion of shared pain and burgeoning hope. He slowly curled his fingers, his hand conforming to the shape of her, and for the first time, he did not pull away. He held on. They did not speak. There were no words for what had just passed between them. He gently withdrew his hand, and she let him go. Without a word, she turned and added a log to the fire. He took off his coat and hung it on its peg. They moved around each other with a new, unspoken understanding. The battle was over. Later, when the fire had burned low, she went to her bedroll on the floor. He went to his cot, but the space between them was no longer an empty void. It was filled with a fragile, trembling connection. He lay awake, listening to her soft breathing. The sound a comfort against the silence of his lonely life. He could still feel the ghost of her heartbeat against his palm. After a long time, he rose from his cot and went to the hearth, lying down on the furs where he had spent the past nights. He was not there to stand guard against her nightmares. He was there because the thought of being even 10 feet away from her was more than he could bear. She stirred in her sleep, and in the faint moonlight, he saw her reach out a hand, as if searching for something. He reached out his own and gently took it. Her fingers curled around his, and she sighed, a soft, contented sound. They spent the night that way, not in a passionate embrace, but in a shared silence, their hands clasped between them. Two survivors finding warmth and safety in the simple, profound act of holding on. The next morning, Eli awoke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The light in the cabin was different, soft and golden. He sat up and saw Clara by the fire, her back to him, stirring something in a skillet. She was wearing one of his shirts. It was a plain homespun shirt, worn soft with use, and it hung on her small frame. The sleeves rolled up to her elbows. On him, it was a simple piece of clothing. On her, it was an intimacy that took his breath away. She turned then, as if sensing he was awake. She smiled, a small, shy smile that transformed her face, erasing the lines of fear and worry. "Good morning," she said softly. He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He watched her as she moved about the cabin, a quiet grace in her movements. He saw her not as a burden, not as trouble, but as the woman who had brought his frozen heart back to life. He watched her with a softness in his eyes that had not been there for 5 long years. They sat at the table to eat, the morning sun streaming through the newly cleared window. "We should talk about the spring," she said, her voice full of a hope that was both beautiful and terrifying to him. "When the pass is clear, we could go somewhere. Oregon. Maybe. I hear you can get land there. We could start over, build something new." He looked at her, at the light in her eyes, the dream of a future she was painting. He wanted it, more than he had wanted anything in years. But the fear was still there, a cold shadow in the corner of his heart. Starting over meant rejoining the world. It meant trusting people. It meant being vulnerable again. "I have not thought that far ahead," he said, his voice quiet. He was a man of the mountains, a man who lived day to day. He dreamed of staying here, hidden and safe, with her by his side. Her dream was of an open world. His was of a closed one. The tension of their two futures hung in the air between them. Before he could say more, he heard it, a sound that did not belong. The rhythmic crunch of horses' hooves in the snow, coming closer. It was more than one horse. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his brief moment of peace shattered. He grabbed his rifle from the wall, his movement swift and sure. He moved to the window, peering cautiously around the edge of the frame. 3 riders were emerging from the line of trees. 2 were hard-faced men with rifles slung across their saddles. The man in the lead was different. He was older, grizzled, with a thick beard and a cruel smile that was visible even from a distance. He sat his horse with an air of arrogant ownership, his eyes fixed on the cabin. Clara came to stand behind Eli, her hand clutching his arm. She looked past him, and a small, choked gasp escaped her lips. All the color drained from her face. "It is him," she whispered, her voice a thread of pure terror. "It is Brody." The man swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the snow. He swaggered toward the cabin, stopping 20 feet from the door. The cruel smile widened. He held up a piece of paper in his gloved hand. "Morgan!" he shouted, his voice a harsh bark that echoed in the quiet morning air. "I have no quarrel with you. I am here for my wife. This paper says she belongs to me, signed and sealed by her stepfather and the town preacher. You can have $100 in gold for your trouble in keeping her safe, or you can have a different kind of trouble. The choice is yours." Eli's hand tightened on the stock of his rifle. He looked from Brody's sneering face to the 2 hired men who sat on their horses, their hands resting near their pistols, their expressions bored and professional. He had seen their kind before, men who killed for coin and called it work. Then he looked at Clara, who stood half hidden behind him, her small hand clutching his sleeve, her knuckles white. He could feel her trembling. That trembling settled something in his soul. The cold, hard anger that had been his companion for 5 years solidified into a purpose. He took a step forward, moving to stand fully between Clara and the men outside. He did not raise the rifle. He held it loosely, a clear sign that he was not looking for a fight, but was more than ready to finish one. "She is not your wife," Eli said, his voice a low, flat rumble that carried easily in the still, cold air. "And this is my land. Leave, now." Brody let out a short, harsh laugh. It was a sound of pure contempt, the laugh of a man who had never been told no and expected to be obeyed. "Your land?" he mocked, waving the piece of paper. "This paper says that woman is my property, and down in Benton. The law agrees with me. I had a nice long talk with Sheriff Cutler. He understands the importance of property rights." The name hit Eli like a punch to the gut. Cutler, the same sheriff who had looked him in the eye and called his wife's murder an accident. The same man who had sold his badge and his soul to the railroad. Of course Brody had him on his payroll. There would be no law here, no justice. There was only what a man could hold on to with his own 2 hands. A bitter, familiar rage rose in him, the taste of ashes in his mouth. "I will not say it again," Eli said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming as cold and dangerous as the ice on the high peaks. "Get off my land." Brody's smile faltered for a second. Seeing the look in Eli's eyes, he saw a man who had nothing left to lose, and that was a man to be wary of. But his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. It was then that Clara moved. She stepped out from behind Eli, her hand dropping from his arm. She walked to his side, her head held high, her shoulders squared. She was no longer trembling. Her eyes, which had been wide with terror, were now narrowed with a defiant fire. She looked directly at Brody, and for the first time, he was seeing not a frightened girl he had bought, but a woman who was judging him and finding him wanting. "I am not your property. Abel Brody," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a conviction that startled every man there. "I do not belong to you. I will never belong to you. You can show that paper to every sheriff from here to the ocean. It means nothing. It is a lie you bought to cover a crime. I would rather die here on this mountain, in the snow, than spend one more minute breathing the same air as you." Her words hung in the frozen air. A declaration of war. Brody's face, which had been twisted in a mocking smile, darkened into a mask of pure fury. His authority had been challenged, his ownership denied, not by the mountain man with the rifle, but by the woman he considered little more than livestock. It was an insult he could not abide. "You will regret those words, girl," he snarled, his voice venomous. He pointed a thick finger at her. "And you, Morgan, you have made a powerful enemy today. When I come back, I will not be offering money." He turned without another word, swung himself back up onto his horse, and spurred the animal around. His 2 men followed, casting long, cold looks at the cabin. They rode back into the trees, their dark shapes disappearing against the white, leaving behind a silence that was more menacing than their threats. Eli waited until they were long gone before he slowly, carefully, let down the hammer on his rifle. He turned to Clara. She was still standing tall, but a fine tremor was running through her body, the aftermath of her courage. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did not have to do that," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. She looked up at him, a fierce light still burning in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "I did. I told you. I am done running." That night, the cabin was no longer a home. It became a fortress. As dusk fell, they worked together in a grim, silent partnership. Eli took down the heavy wooden shutters that had not been used in years and barred them over the window. He checked the door, reinforcing the heavy bar with a wedge of wood. The cabin was now a dark, enclosed space, lit only by the flickering fire and a single lantern. He laid out his tools on the table, the long hunting knife, a heavy wood axe, and a small, vicious-looking hatchet. He began to sharpen each one with the whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the tense silence. He was methodical, his movements precise and deadly. Clara watched him, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. This was real. This was happening. Eli then turned his attention to his weapons. He had the large rifle, a powerful single-shot weapon that could kill a bear at 100 yards. He also had an old pistol, a heavy 6-shooter he kept in a wooden box. He cleaned and oiled each one, his hands moving with an expert familiarity. He laid out the cartridges on the table, counting them. There were not many. Clara came to stand beside him. "Teach me," she said. He looked up from his work, his brow furrowed. "Teach you what?" "How to shoot," she said, her gaze fixed on the rifle. "If they come back, I will not stand by and watch. I will not be helpless." He hesitated. The thought of putting a weapon in her hands, of her having to use it, was abhorrent to him. He wanted to protect her, to keep that darkness away from her. But he looked at her face, at the determined set of her jaw, and he knew he could not deny her this. She had earned the right to defend herself. "All right," he said gruffly. He picked up the heavy pistol first. "The rifle has too much kick. It would break your shoulder. This one, it is easier to handle." He showed her how to hold it, his large hands covering hers, correcting her grip. His touch was impersonal, the touch of a teacher, but she was acutely aware of his closeness, of the strength in his hands. He showed her how to aim, how to line up the sights. "You do not pull the trigger," he explained, his voice low. "You squeeze it, slow and steady. A quick pull will send the shot wide." They could not practice with real shots. The sound would carry for miles, so they practiced aiming, over and over, until her arms ached from the weight of the gun. He made her aim at a knot in the log wall, at the handle of a skillet, at the small wooden horse on the mantel. He was a patient teacher, his voice calm and even, and she was a determined student. The fear was still there, a cold current running beneath the surface, but the act of doing something, of preparing, held it at bay. As they worked, the wind began to rise again, a low moan at first, then a rising howl. Snow began to tap against the shuttered window. The storm, which had offered them a brief reprieve, was returning. It was as if the mountain itself was gathering its fury. sealing them in for the fight to come. By midnight, a full-blown blizzard was raging, the wind battering the cabin, the snow coming down so thick it seemed to muffle the entire world. They were cut off, alone in the heart of the storm. Brody would not be able to return tonight, but he would come. As soon as the storm broke, he would come. They sat by the fire, the weapons cleaned and loaded, resting on the table within easy reach. There was nothing left to do but wait. The silence between them was different now. It was not a silence of comfort or of anger. It was the silence of two soldiers on the eve of a battle, each lost in their own thoughts, yet deeply connected by the shared danger. "I am afraid," Clara confessed, her voice barely a whisper. She was staring into the flames, her face pale in the firelight. "Any sane person would be," Eli answered, his gaze also fixed on the fire. "No," she said, turning to look at him. There were tears shimmering in her eyes. "It is not what you think. I am not afraid of dying. I have been close to that before. I know what it feels like." She took a shaky breath. "I am afraid of losing this quiet, this feeling of being safe. Before I came here, I had forgotten what it felt like. Now it is all I can think about." Her voice broke. "To have it for just a little while, only to have it torn away. I think that is a crueler fate than never having had it at all." Her words struck him to the core. He had spent 5 years believing his life was over, that all the good things were behind him. He had accepted the emptiness, but she had filled it. She had brought light and warmth and hope back into his world, and now he stood to lose it all over again. He saw his own deepest fear reflected in her tear-filled eyes. He moved from his chair and knelt before her, taking her small, trembling hands in his. They were cold as ice. He looked into her face, at the woman who had wandered into his life and had somehow managed to save him from himself. All the walls he had built, all the anger and grief he had hidden behind, crumbled to dust in that moment. He reached up and cupped her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was raw and overwhelming. "For 5 years, this cabin has been a cold place, a tomb. I did not feel the winter, because the winter was inside me." He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. "And then you came. You were half frozen and terrified, and you brought more trouble than I had seen in years. But you made the cold feel like nothing. You made the storm inside me stop." A sob escaped her lips, and she leaned into his touch, her tears falling freely now. He held her there, his hands cradling her face, in a moment of profound and desperate tenderness. It was not a plea or a promise. It was a simple, stark confession. It was his truth. That night, they did not sleep in their separate beds. They lay together on the fur pelts before the hearth, wrapped in a single blanket, the fire casting a warm, golden glow over them. It was not a night of frantic passion, but of a deep and quiet coming together. They moved with a reverence, a slowness, as if they were performing a sacred rite. His touch was gentle, worshipful, and hers was trusting and open. They were not just two bodies seeking pleasure, they were two souls seeking solace, finding a final, perfect moment of peace in a world that was about to be torn apart by violence. In the heart of the storm, with the threat of death just outside their door, their bond deepened, transforming from a fragile connection of shared survival into the unbreakable strength of love. They must have drifted to sleep, because the sound that woke them was sharp and violent, shattering the peace. It was the crack of a rifle, and the splintering of wood as a bullet tore through the heavy cabin door. Eli was moving before he was fully awake, shoving Clara behind him, grabbing his own rifle from the floor. Another shot slammed into the door, then another into the shuttered window. They were surrounded. "Morgan!" Brody's voice roared, barely audible over the wind. "Send out the woman, and we will let you live!" Eli knew it was a lie. He crept to a small peephole near the door and looked out. The storm had lessened slightly, the snow now a thick, swirling curtain. He could make out at least 4 figures moving through the trees, using the cover of the woods to advance on the cabin. "Stay down," he whispered to Clara, who was huddled by the hearth, her face ashen. He moved to the side of the door and fired his rifle through one of the thick logs, aiming not at a man, but at the space between them. The roar of the gun inside the small cabin was deafening. It was a warning shot, a statement that he would not surrender. The answer was a volley of gunfire. Bullets thudded into the log walls, sending splinters of wood flying. Eli fired again, and a cry of pain came from the darkness outside. He had hit one of them. He worked with a cold, deadly efficiency, reloading and firing, moving between the door and the window, using the small gaps in the logs as firing ports. He was a fierce and capable fighter, a man defending his home, his life, his love. But he was outnumbered. For every shot he fired, 3 came back in return. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his shirt, grazing his arm. Another slammed into the wall just inches from his head. He was crouched by the window, trying to get a clear shot at a man who was moving to flank the cabin, when the front door suddenly shuddered under a heavy blow. They were using a log as a battering ram. The heavy wooden bar groaned in protest. Eli turned, his face grim. He knew he could not hold them off for much longer. The door would give way soon, and they would pour in. He looked at Clara. She was no longer huddled by the fire. She was on her knees, the heavy pistol held in both of her trembling hands, just as he had taught her. Her eyes were wide with terror, but her hands were steady. The door crashed again, the wood splintering. The bar was beginning to crack. A third crash, and the bar broke with a sound like a gunshot. The door flew open, and a figure burst in, a dark shape against the swirling snow. It was Brody. He had a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of triumphant fury. He saw Eli and raised his gun. Time seemed to slow down. Eli tried to bring his rifle around, but he was too slow. He saw the dark hole of Brody's pistol, saw the flash of hatred in the man's eyes. He knew he was about to die. Then a sound exploded next to him, a deafening roar that was not his own gun. Clara, still on her knees, had fired the pistol. The recoil sent her staggering backward, but her aim had been true. A look of stunned surprise crossed Brody's face. He looked down at his chest, at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt. He took one stumbling step into the cabin, his pistol falling from his nerveless fingers. Then he collapsed onto the floor, his eyes wide and vacant. Outside, the other men, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Eli took the opportunity, firing his rifle out the open door. One of the men cried out and fell back into the snow. The other 2, their nerve broken, turned and fled, disappearing into the storm. Silence descended, absolute and profound, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. The fight was over. Eli let out a long, shuddering breath and sagged against the wall. A sharp, searing pain flared in his side, and he looked down. There was a dark patch of blood spreading across his shirt, a wound he had not even felt in the heat of the battle. The strength drained out of him, and his legs gave way. He slid down the wall, his rifle clattering to the floor. "Eli!" Clara's scream filled the cabin. She scrambled to his side, her face a mess of tears and terror. She saw the blood, the gray pallor of his skin. He was alive, but he was badly wounded, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She hooked her arms under his and began to drag him away from the open door, away from the cold and the snow, toward the warmth and the safety of the fire. She was weeping, her tears falling onto his face, but she did not stop. She had not run, she had not been helpless, and she would not let him die. The world after the gunfire was a vortex of blood, snow, and the raw, animal scent of fear. Clara dragged Eli across the rough floorboards, her muscles screaming. her breath coming in ragged sobs. He was a dead weight, his head lolling, a stream of blood leaving a dark trail on the wood. She managed to get him onto the fur pelts before the fire, his body a broken testament to the violence that had just shattered their world. The open door let in the storm, and the body of Abel Brody lay half in, half out of the cabin, a grim monument to her desperate act. For a moment she was paralyzed, the sheer horror of it all threatening to swallow her. Then Eli groaned, a low, pained sound, and the paralysis broke. He was alive. Nothing else mattered. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she forced the heavy, splintered door shut and dropped the broken bar into its brackets. It would not hold against another assault, but it held back the storm. She turned to Eli, her mind racing. The bullet had entered his side, low and to the right. It was bleeding sluggishly, a dark, pulsing stain that grew with every beat of his heart. She knew what she had to do. The knowledge was a cold, hard thing, gleaned from overheard conversations and the harsh realities of a life where doctors were a luxury. She tore strips from her petticoat, her hands moving with a frantic purpose. She stoked the fire until it roared, setting a pot of water on to boil. She found his small flask of whiskey, pouring some of the fiery liquid onto a clean rag.
"Eli,"
she whispered, her voice choked.
I am so sorry."
She pressed the whiskey-soaked cloth to the wound. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore through her, his body arching in agony. Tears streamed down her face, but she held the cloth firm, cleaning the wound as best she could. The bleeding was deep. The bullet was still inside. She took his long hunting knife, the one he had sharpened with such deadly intent just hours before. Her hand trembled so violently she could barely hold it. She held the tip of the blade in the roaring flames until it glowed a dull, angry red. Taking a deep breath, she knelt beside him. She had to be the strong one now. The weeks that followed blurred into a long, nightmarish cycle of fear and exhaustion. The bullet, by some miracle, had passed through the fleshy part of his side, missing anything vital. But the wound was deep and ragged. Fever set in, a raging fire that consumed him. He thrashed in his delirium, his body slick with sweat, his eyes wide and seeing things only he could see. He called out a name, over and over, his voice raw with a grief that was terrifying in its intensity. "Sarah," he would cry, his hands reaching for someone who was not there. "Sarah, I am sorry." Clara never left his side. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of broth between his cracked lips, and cleaned and dressed the wound with a devotion that bordered on religious. She slept in snatches, curled on the floor beside him, one hand resting on his chest, as if she could keep his heart beating through sheer will alone. She talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur, telling him stories she did not know she remembered, humming tunes her mother had sung to her. She willed him to live, pouring all of her own life force into his flagging spirit. Outside, the world began to change. The great storm that had been their crucible finally broke. The endless snows ceased, and a profound silence fell over the mountains. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the thaw began. During the day, water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, a sound as steady and hopeful as a heartbeat. The mountain of snow that had buried their world began to shrink, revealing the dark, wet earth beneath. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the shooting, she was changing his dressing when his eyes opened. They were clear. The fever was gone. He looked at her, his gaze lucid and aware.
"Clara,"
he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. A sob of pure relief escaped her. "You are back," she said, her tears falling onto his hand. His recovery was slow and arduous. At first, he could barely sit up, but with each passing day, a little more strength returned to him. He watched her as she tended to him, his expression one of quiet awe. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, The way her hands, though gentle, were raw and chapped from work. He had saved her from the storm, but she had saved him from the grave. It was a debt he knew he could never repay. One morning, the sound of an approaching visitor sent a jolt of alarm through them both. Eli instinctively reached for the rifle he now kept beside his cot, but Clara put a calming hand on his arm. It was Jedediah, the old trapper, his mule in tow. Jedediah's eyes went wide as he took in the scene. The splintered, hastily repaired door, the dark stains on the floorboards that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove, and Eli, pale and thin, propped up on his cot.
"Good Lord, son,"
the trapper breathed, his gaze full of concern.
"I heard Brody and his men were headed this way. I feared the worst."
Eli gave a grim nod.
"They came? They are not coming back?"
Jedediah's eyes shifted to Clara, who stood quietly by the fire. He looked at her with a new and profound respect.
"The story is all over, Benton,"
he said, his voice low.
"They found Brody and one of his men frozen solid down in the valley. The other two came back with a wild tale. They said the woman shot Brody herself. Shot him dead to save you."
Clara flushed, looking down at the floor.
It sounded so brutal when said aloud.
Eli looked at her, his expression softening.
"It is the truth,"
he said simply. Jedediah shook his head in amazement.
"Folks are talking.
The men are calling you a she-cat, a wild woman of the mountains. But the women—" He paused, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "The women in town are telling a different story. They are saying you are the bride who refused to be bought, the woman who stood her ground. They are raising a glass to you in the saloons and whispering your name in the sewing circles.
You have become a legend,
Miss." After the trapper left, leaving them with fresh supplies and a world of news, a new quiet settled between them. The story of her bravery, of their shared fight, was now a part of the land itself. She was no longer just a victim. She had a new name, a new identity, forged in fire and ice. A few days later, Eli was strong enough to sit in a chair by the door, watching the last of the snow melt away in the strengthening sun. He looked thin and worn, but the hardness had gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep and abiding tenderness whenever he looked at her.
"You should go,"
he said one afternoon, his voice quiet. He did not look at her as he spoke. "Jedediah is headed down to Oregon in a month. He would see you there safely. It is good land. You could start over. No one would know your past. You would be truly safe." He was offering her the future she had once dreamed of. He was offering her freedom, an escape from the ghosts that haunted this mountain. He was trying to protect her, to give her the life he felt she deserved, a life he did not believe he could be a part of. Clara walked over to him and stood before his chair. She looked down at this man who had taken her in, who had fought for her, who was now willing to let her go for her own good. A soft, gentle laugh escaped her lips. He looked up, confused by her reaction.
"What is it?"
She did not answer. She simply bent down and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of certainty. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a kiss that ended a long and painful journey. She pulled back and looked into his eyes.
"I am home, Eli?"
she said softly. They rebuilt the cabin together. It was slow work, dictated by his still recovering strength, but it was a labor of love, a physical manifestation of their own healing. He taught her how to mix clay and grass to chink the bullet holes in the logs, their hands brushing as they worked the mixture into the wood. He showed her how to use his plane to smooth a new plank for the door, his arm around her as he guided her hands. They were not just repairing walls, they were mending their own shattered hearts, building a foundation for a future they had both thought impossible. The physical work of rebuilding mirrored the rebuilding of his soul. With Clara by his side, the fire for justice that he had thought long extinguished was rekindled. Jedediah had brought news that Brody's death had thrown the region into chaos. The railroad company, sensing instability, was making another aggressive push. and Sheriff Cutler was openly in their pocket. But a federal marshal, sent to investigate the widespread corruption, had arrived in Benton. One morning, Eli came out of the barn, his jaw set with a new resolve. He was wearing the one good shirt he owned. "I am riding to Benton," he said.
Clara's heart clenched with fear. "Why?"
"Because that marshal needs to hear the truth," he said, his eyes burning with a righteous fire she had never seen before. "Not just about Brody, about everything, about the railroad, about Cutler, about Sarah." He said his wife's name without the usual agony, but with a quiet strength. It was no longer a name that haunted him. It was a name that propelled him. He rode into town, a place he had not set foot in for 5 years. He walked into the marshal's office and told his story. He spoke of his wife's murder, of the sheriff's corruption, of the reign of fear the railroad had imposed. He was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was a man demanding justice for it. His testimony, combined with the whispers and fears of other settlers who were emboldened by his courage, started a fire that would eventually burn the corruption out of the county. He rode back to the cabin that evening, his shoulders a little straighter, the ghost of his past finally at peace. While he was gone, Clara had undertaken a task of her own. She sat at the table with a pen and a precious sheet of paper. She thought of the life she had escaped, of the other women she had known, trapped in their own quiet prisons of fear and duty. She began to write, not just for herself, but for them. It was a letter addressed to a young woman who had worked as a maid in her stepfather's house. But her words were for anyone who needed to hear them. "Do not believe them when they say you are worthless," she wrote, her pen flying across the page. "Do not believe them when they say you have no choice. Your life is your own. It is a precious and wild thing, and you must fight for it. It will be the hardest thing you have ever done. You will be terrified. But I tell you, the fear of running is nothing compared to the slow death of staying. Run, fight, live. There is a world waiting for you that you cannot yet imagine, a world where you are not property, but a person. Find it." She folded the letter and gave it to Jedediah on his next trip, asking him to see that it found its way into the right hands. It was a message of hope, sent out from her small sanctuary on the mountain. Spring arrived in full glory. The land, washed clean by the melting snow, burst forth in a riot of green. The creek rushed with clear, cold water, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. One bright, warm afternoon. Clara was on her knees in the small patch of soil in front of the cabin. She had found a cluster of wild bluebells growing by the creek, and she was carefully replanting them, bringing their vibrant color to her home. It was an act of faith, a promise of beauty and permanence. The cabin door opened, and Eli stepped out. The last of his wounds had healed, leaving behind a puckered scar on his side that she had traced with her fingers 100 times. He was no longer the gaunt, haunted man she had found. He was strong, his shoulders broad, his eyes clear and calm. He walked over to her and stood watching for a moment, a soft smile on his face. He bent down and wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her up to her feet and holding her close against his chest. She leaned back into his embrace, her hands covering his, a feeling of perfect peace settling over her. He rested his chin on her shoulder and looked out at the thriving, green world around them. "The storm's over," he whispered, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. "You are the calm I never knew I needed." She closed her eyes, a contented smile on her lips, and placed her free hand on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. A gentle breeze swept up the mountainside, rustling the leaves of the aspen trees and stirring the petals of the newly planted flowers. Their long winter was over. They had survived the storms without and the storms within. And here, on their small patch of earth, in the quiet embrace of the mountains, they had finally found their spring. Thank you for gathering around the campfire with us for this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect
And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.